This week we will begin our consideration of arguments for the existence of God. The first argument we will consider is known as the ontological argument. This is a particularly difficult type of argument to get one's mind around. Ontology is the branch of philosophy which studies being, and the arguments which we will study this week are called ontological because they all, in one way or another, involve an analysis of the concept of being as such. Ontological arguments are also distinguished from the other arguments we will consider, the cosmological and teleological arguments, in that they are a priori, not based on sense experience. They begin with the definition of the nature of God, and then proceed by analyzing that definition in order to show that it logically entails existence. The earliest formal statement of the ontological argument is in the Proslogion of Anselm of Canterbury, who wrote during the 11th century. He writes as follows: "Even a fool, when he hears of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his understanding. And assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. But obviously that is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, which exists both in the understanding and in reality." This may be rather difficult to follow, but it can be summarized simply as follows. God, for Anselm, is that than which nothing greater can be thought. This idea exists in our minds. But it is better to exist in reality as well as in our minds than to exist just in our minds. So if God existed just in our minds, he would not be that than which nothing greater can be thought. Therefore, God exists. René Descartes, writing in the 17th century, restates the argument in a way which makes its underlying simplicity clear. By God, he says, we mean a supremely perfect being, a being which has all possible perfections. But existence is a perfection, therefore God must exist. Muslim versions of the ontological argument focus, not surprisingly given the Muslim emphasis on radical monotheism, on analyzing the consequences of the unity of being or existence. Thus Mullah Sadr, writing in the late 16th and early 17th century, argues for the existence of God as follows. Existence is a single, objective, and simple reality. There is no difference between its parts, unless in terms of perfection and imperfection, strength and weakness. And the culmination of its perfection, where there is nothing more perfect, is its independence from any other thing. Nothing more perfect should be conceivable, as every imperfect thing belongs to another thing and needs this other thing to become perfect. And, as has already been explicated, perfection is prior to imperfection, actuality to potency, and existence to non-existence. Also, it has been explained that the perfection of a thing is the thing itself, and not a thing in addition to it. Thus, either existence is independent of others, or it is in need of them. The former is the necessary, which is pure existence. Nothing is more perfect than him, and in him there is no room for non-existence or imperfection. The latter is other than him, and is regarded as his acts and effects. For other than him there is no subsistence unless through him. For there is no imperfection in the reality of existence, and imperfection is added to existence only because of the quality of being caused, as it is impossible for an effect to be identical with its cause in terms of existence. What Mullah Sadr is doing here is pointing out that being is essentially one. Individual things participate in being in different degrees, but they do not have separate acts of being. There is, in other words, a scale of being or an ontological hierarchy, and this hierarchy has a maximal point or element. This point is God, who is the being in which everything else shares. There are, not surprisingly, a number of criticisms of the ontological argument. Thomas Aquinas, for example, argues that Anselm begs the question, that he assumes what he is trying to prove. This is because when we say God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, we are, in effect, already saying that God exists. He also points out that the argument would make no sense to someone like a non-believer, for example, who did not already know the nature of God. David Hume takes a different approach, arguing that we cannot demonstrate the existence of God a priori. This is because the only way to demonstrate the existence of anything a priori is to show that its non-existence is self-contradictory. We must be unable to imagine that it does not exist. But we can imagine that God does not exist, and so his non-existence is not a contradiction. The existence of God, if it can be demonstrated at all, and we'll see that Hume has serious questions about this, can be demonstrated only a posteriori, on the basis of experience. Immanuel Kant's critique of the ontological argument builds on Hume's critique. For Kant, the ontological argument does not work because being is not a real predicate. What analytic arguments do is to tease out the implications of a definition. Thus, the definition of a triangle as a two-dimensional polygon with three sides implies that it also has three angles. But existence, he says, does not work this way. It is not a property that can be implicit in other properties. When we say that something exists, we are saying that it is exemplified in the world, and the existence of something cannot be demonstrated except by reference to empirical evidence. What is your response to the ontological argument? Does the argument work logically, or are one or more of the criticisms correct? Even if it works logically, will the ontological argument ever convince a non-believer? Or is that even really its purpose? In the end, the ontological argument essentially says that God is the power of being as such, and that this power exists necessarily. It is rather akin to saying that existence exists. This could be regarded as a vacuous tautology, and even many believers experience the ontological argument as a kind of ridiculous mind game. But there's another way to look at it, and one which I think gets the core of why we do philosophy of religion. Perhaps what the ontological argument is really doing is to point out something about the nature of God and the nature of existence. God is existence. Existence, which exists by definition, is what we mean by the word God, and is thus worthy of supreme reverence. I look forward to your reflections.